Okay, this is the audio review for Future of Inequalities, Chapter 9, Identities and Inequalities. Okay, so when discussing the possibilities of altering inequalities, there are inherent difficulties in promoting equality, right? So we've made some progress in attacking individual discrimination, but the problem with inequality is that it can go much deeper, right? It can become embedded within our social institutions, within our cultural value systems, right? And so in that way, when they get kind of put into our institutions, they form this kind of notion of institutional discrimination, which is much harder to combat than individual discrimination. So this is really the role of social movements. These are often what's needed in order to spur on social change so that those institutional inequalities can be addressed, right? So we can see this in movements of the past, like the civil rights movement, that worked to rectify the issues of, institutional inequalities within the systems when it came to race and ethnicity, right? You have the women's rights movement looking at the same thing, looking at how the structures of law, the structures of, basically society embedded in these institutions are the value systems in the society. So if those value systems are unequal or give more power to certain groups over others, then of course, obviously that leads to horrible outcomes, right? So same thing when we look at the queer rights movement or the environmental movement, or, more in the modern day, we have like the Me Too movement or, Black Lives Matter or things like this that are still trying to address the more structural inequalities, the way that these issues we talk about are actually built into the systems that operate. And so as a result, we can change people's overall perceptions of these things, but if the operation of the system continues that way, there's not much that's done, right? Like we look at the criminal justice system is a great example of this, where while, we can try to do certain things to try to control, certain discriminatory aspects of the criminal justice system, because the institution itself has such a racial bias, it perpetuates that inequality, right? So it's not just a matter of, okay, get rid of all the racist judges. It's the structure of the system itself that lends to this, meaning there's plenty of judges that aren't racist, but because of the structures of the laws and the policies and policing and war on drugs and all this other fun stuff, they end up producing unequal outcomes, oftentimes because of mandatory minimums or things like this, where it actually takes away the discretion of a judge to determine whether or not that person's actually, meets a certain standard to have a certain punishment, right? Or if there's some sort of extenuating circumstances to explain, why they should have a shorter sentence. So that's just one example of how, the social movements themselves, if you have a large social movement pushing for, reform in the criminal justice system, that gives a justification to lawmakers to change the laws. It gives an opportunity for those systems to amend their policies and practices. And that obviously can then alleviate a lot of inequalities within those systems themselves. And as we can see through the civil rights movement, women's rights movement, queer rights movement, while none of those are done, none of the goal of civil rights hasn't been fully established, or women's rights or any of those things, you can still see that there has been a measurable amount of progress, right, during that same time period. So clearly that's the way that we can best address these problems, is to collectivize together, unify our voices for change, right? But a lot of people feel hopeless, right? This idea that the problem is too big. You can feel very hopeless when you learn about the gravity of and the scope of these social inequalities, right? Because these social problems are so huge that it can feel like it's too big to fix. It can make us very nihilistic and think that there's nothing that can be done. But in reality, we have agency, right? We're able to affect change in our own lives and, of course, in our greater communities. And so this, even though we feel like sometimes, okay, well, sure, I volunteer, I do this or that, what does that really matter? But it does, because you have an impact on your local community that is a ripple effect, right? Like throwing a stone into a pond. Your good deeds then inform and act on others. And those things can have oftentimes ripple effects that you'll never see, but you should still do them, right? Because it's not about the gratitude or, seeing the results of it as much as it is, you can be a positive force for positive change, or you can do nothing, right? So for a lot of people that are informed by these kind of understandings of the research and the knowledge of inequalities that are out there, this is our motivation to engage in activism, to do something about those inequalities, right? So we do have agency, right? We just have to collectivize and work together. And so when we do those things, we can form organizations and movements, and those provide alternatives and solutions for the status quo so that we can replace it with more equitable systems. So this is done in a lot of different ways, right? You have sit-ins, work-ins, teach-ins, die-ins, right? Various strategies that have proven effective. So this just means that even a small group of people can affect social change, right? So if you use a sit-in to occupy a space to bring attention to an issue. So this was a strategy made famous in the civil rights movement, right? Using segregated situations as a base point for these kind of sit-ins, right? So I'm sure you've, either seen footage of or heard of the kind of lunch counter strikes during Jim Crow segregation, right? Where basically even parts of restaurants were segregated. So this meant that, in order to basically challenge those unfair laws that said that you couldn't sit at the counter unless you were white, you had actually kind of a multiracial coalition, but of course led by Black activists that, would go to these counters, sit there and demonstrate and bring attention to the fact that that practice was so unequal, right? And it was incredibly effective. I mean, obviously these people were putting themselves in extreme danger by engaging in that, right? By opening themselves up to violence and ridicule and all these things. But we look at those things now as what we call positive deviance. This idea that, yes, a sit-in in some cases is against the law, right? But what kind of, like what MLK said, like, what kind of law is that, right? That we still have to strive for justice. And so it's kind of complicated because a lot of people always use the law or the political structures or whatever the social structures are at the time to use it as a justification for those inequalities, meaning, well, yeah, it's not fair, but that's the law. But the problem is that, the law doesn't necessarily mean something's just, right? I mean, obviously Jim Crow segregation, not just, right? When we look at, the idea of slavery as an institution was legally justified at some point, not just, right? Women being legally subordinated, not just. Like any of these things, they were laws. So we can't just assume that the legal structure protects everyone or will protect everyone, even if those things are there. Meaning sometimes we put in things into law, but if there's no enforcement or there's no teeth, right, in order to kind of actually make people act, like this isn't a problem with the environmental movement, that some policies have been put into place, but there's no way to actually force those industries to comply, that makes it basically problematic, right? Or another one would be housing discrimination issues, right? That sometimes there are some laws on the books that either protect against, racial ethnic discrimination, impoverish people not being able to gain housing. So you have these affordable housing laws. But again, a lot of those don't have any teeth, meaning there's nobody advocating for the rights of people. There's not free lawyers or these kind of things providing these services. And if they are, they're very limited. And so it makes it very difficult for, even though the law is on the books, people can say, well, look, there's an equal housing law or there's, equal employment law. So therefore, what are people complaining about? But ultimately, we have to hold these things actually accountable. And largely, it's social movements that push this metric forward, right? So going back to sit-ins, work-ins, teach-ins, die-ins, work-ins are really fascinating to me. So this is when workers take over their job. And this is typically in situations where they're about to be laid off in order to like protest being laid off. So we've had some pretty high-profile ones in the U.S. where people have shut down, mills or factories of other kinds and just basically taken over, continue to work to kind of show just how important they are, right? And so this is actually interesting. There's a very famous, kind of anarchist example of this in Spain where, anarchist collectives took over some aspects of production in Spain for a period of time. And what's really fascinating is just to see how they better organize the structure of the industry itself, meaning, worker pay much more equitable, workers' rights much more respected. So it's interesting to see how, sometimes that can be a really effective strategy to call attention to unequal rights in the workplace, to call attention to the need for better, reforms within that, or really just to call attention to the issues of globalization, where we shut down factories in one area, move them to another place around the globe to further exploit those workers, to not give them the same safety protections, environmental protections, not give them the same pay. And so a lot of times, we're kind of starting to understand when it comes to issues of poverty or, globalization, that we're all the more and more free trade, quote unquote, free trade happens, the more our labor is connected to each other, right? So that person being laid off in Detroit when they close that factory, their exploitation by the company, their consequences of their labor is connected to, the workers that then get paid a fraction of what this person in Detroit got paid in another country to make the same products, right? So the exploitation continues. So the more we collectivize, the more we call attention to these things, especially in the industry of work, the more we can then transform systems to be much more equitable, right? Teach-ins are also important and often happen in the context of college, right? And so this is just when someone knowledgeable on an issue sets up an informal space to educate people that are motivated to create social change, or sometimes in an attempt to educate people that are ignorant to social issues, right? Actually, I was really lucky to have the opportunity at Cal State Fullerton when I was in grad school there to meet Henry Giroux, who I've read a bunch of his books, and he's rad as hell. But basically, he did this whole teach-in about student debt. And I'll never forget it, because he made us write on placards that we hung around our neck how much debt we were in for school. And see, personally, I didn't need to go into debt for undergrad. I was very lucky, working multiple jobs, getting, scholarships, financial aid, stuff like that. But, that Pell Grant saved me. But in grad school, that funding was cut. Long story short, I needed to take out loans, and it was very stressful. So when I looked around at the other students in this group and how much money they were in debt, some of them were 2, 3, 4 times as much as I was. I saw this one guy, he had like $60,000 on a placard around his neck. And that pales in comparison to some universities where, because of their costs being even higher, students are going into more and more debt. So it was really interesting exercise. We sat on the green area, kind of like near where that Titan sign is, where everyone wants to go take pictures with it. That was before that sign was there, but that area near the TSU. And he really laid out some of the facts and figures related to this, and really what we could do as a campus community to resist it, to resist tuition hikes, to resist basically the need for that to happen, and really to organize to try to get our college, the administrators, and God forbid the chancellors, to change these policies in a more student-centered direction so people can leave school without huge amounts of debt, right? Die-ins are another interesting kind of protest where, and this is often used to protest war, right? Like I remember I went to this protest of the Iraq War before the Iraq War started. It's kind of an interesting historical moment in our American history. It was like the first war that was protested before it even started. But a lot of people came there, and they were demonstrating in downtown LA. People covered themselves in blood, right, and laid down on the street to try to bring attention to the consequences of these social actions. Meaning, we can make policy or political decisions, but oftentimes we're not thinking about the human toll, the consequences that come from this. So sometimes people stage die-ins to bring more attention to this, or, a very famous one happened in the 1990s in front of the White House, where people staged large-scale die-ins as a result of the Reagan and then Bush administration not acting on the HIV/AIDS crisis, because they thought it was only affecting IV drug users and gay men. But of course, we know that that's just not the case. But because IV drug users, and specifically gay men, were such a marginal category, the resources were just not available. So some people even took the ashes of their loved ones that had died from the disease and poured some of it on the White House lawn. And, staged these large-scale die-ins to kind of bring attention to the fact that people were dying in record numbers from this disease, but we weren't taking it as a public health consequence because we thought, as a society, if it's only marginal people being affected, then who cares? And that's so a reflection of how our policies are filtered through who we think is valuable and who's not, right? So if it was only people on Wall Street that are billionaires that were getting a disease, guess what? We would act day one. But when it's considered people that are unsocially desirable because of these different hegemonies, we don't really act as we should, right? So again, it takes more than the actions of the oppressed for meaningful long-term change to occur. So this is very important, right? Something that MLK understood when he let those kids get blasted by water hoses, right, on TV, or when he picked Rosa Parks to do that whole civil disobedience thing, which again, if you don't already know, then it was really Claudette Colvin that did what Rosa Parks did as a teenage woman, actually, which is really remarkable. But because Claudette wasn't considered like a worthy, long story short, basically perceptions of the Black community were integral to the progress of the civil rights movement, right? So there was this fear that Claudette wouldn't be seen as a worthy victim because she was a teenager. No one likes teenagers. She was broke. Her father was an alcoholic, and she was then soon after a teen mother. So there's this idea that like if a 16-year-old girl who's pregnant stands up and says, no, I don't, or doesn't stand up on the bus and says, no, I'm not going to give you my spot, that's considered more insolence than it's considered courageous. But then having Rosa Parks, someone who was regarded positively in her job, in her church, in her community, had no skeletons in any closet, had no way that people could malign her, having her do that same thing but act as if it was a spontaneous event, which it was not. But fun fact, then, it was taken much more seriously, and it's still something that we talk about and teach our kids about because we understand just how important and heroic that movement was, right? The Montgomery bus boycotts that resulted from it and all of it, right? These kind of important turning points in the civil rights movement. But it's interesting that it really comes down to the visibility of and really the worthiness of certain people. That if, MLK wanted to make sure that white people cared, that they actually saw what was happening, because it's so easy to frame people in a deviant form and dismiss their rights, right? So, like, for example, letting those kids protest, and people all across the country sitting in their comfortable middle-class white living rooms saw little kids being attacked by dogs and being sprayed with hoses. And if you haven't seen the footage, I mean, it's horrific. It's incredibly hard to watch. And so this really galvanized people because a lot of people realized, like, wow, it's actually worse than I thought. And that they saw just how much impunity the police had to just, treat people so horribly. So again, it's this idea, though, that sometimes he knew, like MLK understood, that without the consensus of the larger population, it was going to be difficult to achieve the kind of large-scale social changes that he hoped to achieve, right? So this doesn't mean like, oh, the white people need to lead the movement. Obviously not. It just means you need allyship, right? Meaning, like, for example, with women's rights, right? There's always been male allies in the women's rights movement, right? Since the very beginning, there's been men that are self-identified feminists that, work hard in their own realms and ways to address the issues of inequality between men and women, right? Or if you look at the queer rights movement, there's many heterosexual allies that respect different family forms, that, really advocate for and care about the rights of people that, maybe don't have the same sexual identity as they do, right? So it's interesting that a lot of these movements, we take that for granted. When you look at any of these social movements, there's always allies. And the idea is that, for example, like, let's say we're talking about civil rights, it's on the allies to educate other people that are privileged. I just feel like I have to say that, right? Meaning it's not on those being oppressed to explain why and how they're being oppressed, right? It's like this bizarre thing that we do in our society where it's like, oh, you have a social concern? Well, then let's give you some extra homework. Explain to me why I should give a crap. Which is like wrong on so many levels, because first it's basically like justify to me that I should care. And then after that, it's really just a measure of how ignorant or just ill-informed people are about things, right? That they basically can just be so flippant of like, well, why can't you just explain it to me? Put it in, how many characters I need to make it a tweet or whatever it is. Instead of actually like really coming to terms with, we should care about the rights of people that aren't just us. And when we understand and form social movements and collectivize, we realize just how united our issues are. And this is why I'm like really motivated by these amazing social movements that have come out of the recent era, which I find fascinating, like Occupy, or even the WTO protests that kind of preceded that, where some people think of it as economic, some people think of it as social, but really, Occupy movement was unifying all sorts of different social movements under the same banner, right? Or the kind of predecessor, the 1999 WTO protests in Seattle, which of course got incredibly violent. And that's a whole nother thing. But in those protests, it was fascinating to see, feminists, different kind of civil rights organizations, workers' rights, environmentalists, trade unions, and all of these different groups come together to see how capitalism and globalization and free trade was screwing all of them, right? When you think about globalization, that's related to economic inequality, that's related to social inequality, it's related to political inequality, it's really related to environmental destruction and all sorts of other things. But if we're only staying in our own little camp, if I'm only standing over here advocating for my rights and you're standing over there advocating for your rights, and we don't see that even though we have different social identities, about 80 to 90% of our issues overlap. We don't see, hey, we should stand arm in arm and I should advocate for those that don't have the privileges I do, and they should advocate for me having the privileges that I don't have, and we can all collectivize and see that we have so much more in common than we are different, right? And so this is why I was so inspired by that kind of collectivist notion of Occupy movement, that there was no organized leadership, that it was a very collectivized structure, right? And really, it kind of gave us this understanding that there's the 99% and the 1%, right? That when you really look at it, the way we divide ourselves and the culture, we love to slice everybody up into different groups because it's a clear divide and conquer strategy, right? But the more people there are collectivizing together, caring about each other's lives and rights and opportunities, and seeing how if I can lift up your status and your abilities, that also helps me and my community. That no matter what, lifting everybody up is the right thing to do. It makes us all better. It makes the whole society better. There's so many metrics we could measure that on, right? But it takes those coalitions for long-term change to occur, right? And the more we can see hey, 99% of us are in the same boat. That's something that can kind of transcend a lot of these weird boundaries we put in there, because we've talked about this previously. A lot of social movements have flaws of not including marginalized people in those struggles, meaning there were historically problems within the LGBTQ movement as, to ethno-racial minorities, or even within the civil rights movement to queer minorities, or things of this nature, that we need to pay attention and really include everyone at the table. And that the peoples whose voices should be lifted and elevated are those who represent the marginalities that we're fighting to, kind of alleviate those inequalities, right? So it shouldn't just be oh, I'm a white person, I'm going to speak on behalf of whatever. No. But if I'm an ally, I'm going to help educate every white person that I come in contact with that's ignorant, to try to save that from people who are actually struggling with the day-to-day inequalities of racism. They are going through enough. They don't need to stop and educate you about everything all the time, right? It's also we have this thing called Google. What the hell's wrong with people? I get this on Twitter all the time. People are well, explain to me how blah, blah, blah. And you're it's called Google. Just Google it. Just talking facts here. It's just easy to Google. But again, also working as a librarian for many years, I know that people can use the internet, but they don't really know how to use the internet. But anyway, so, it's this really fundamental thing that we need to really think about how, we can really expand our own notions of what we care about, of what movements are important to us, and realize that even though there's some inequality, remember, we're all connected. And if there's a group that we're allowed to persecute or malign or put down, that just opens up the door for every other group to become more marginal and be targeted. Okay, so discussing the future is important, but it can often be more dubious, right, than predicting the weather, because human behavior is erratic, right? We look at projections, not predictions, meaning we have no crystal ball. We have no way to say, okay, this is exactly what's going to happen, but we do have some ideas based on what we've seen so far, right? So meaning from 1900 to now, when we look at ethno-racial outlooks, Americans lived distinctly separate racial worlds. There was 30 years, only 30 years, between slavery and Jim Crow segregation. The reality was most people took the divided racial landscape for granted, right? That America was that's just what America was. So many immigrants came to this country knowing English, practicing Christianity, and those things were taken for granted as well. But in the 21st century, things are much more diverse, right? And so the growth of racial minority populations is also growing. And so this is also why you get all those KKK folks coming out of the woodwork, or someone picked up a large rock in the form of Donald Trump and really kind of popularized a lot of this revolting. But no matter what, the growth in the Latino population, that's just the reality, right? Soon the majority of Americans will point to Latin ancestry, right, overtaking the long-held white majority. So between 2000 and 2010, the general population increased by 8%, while the Latinx population grew by 43%. And so this is, again, this just makes all those, white supremacists like lose their minds. But it's just as any other culture. Cultures ebb and flow, they change. And the impact of immigration is an important one on the shaping of a nation, right? Also, so when it comes to another assumption, we still assume everyone's Christian, right? Which is interesting. Although there's much more religious diversity. And I mean, one of the hallmarks of our country is this idea of being able to practice your own religion, being able to have your own faith. Yet for some reason, we kind of forget about that and just default everyone to Christian, right? So most people still define themselves as religious, even if they're not Christian. So instead of seeing this diversity as a strength, some see it as a threat to their assumed social dominance or the assumed prominence of their particular kind of Christianity. And this is something I can't, if I could put some clips in here, I would all day, like the Fox News stuff where they're like, it's a war on Christmas, it's an attack on this, all these insane things to act as if somehow Christians are being persecuted, right? As in, I can't deny this gay couple a cake, so therefore my Christian identity is being affected. So it's really interesting. You saw these kind of laws supposedly protecting religious freedom, but they're really targeted towards, making sure that minorities like, same-sex couples don't have the same access that heterosexual couples have, right? So it's, again, just an interesting way that we look at our assumptions versus the realities are much more diverse and interesting, but we often amalgamate everyone to a norm. Also, there's a lot of these ideas that we're in a post-racial society, racism's in the past, and clearly that's not true, right? So when we talk about ethno-racial boundaries, these could simply go away with more interracial marriages. And so the more children are born with multiracial or multi-ethnic identities, this really complicates those incredibly few racial categories we like to put everybody into, right? And so it's interesting that within a couple generations, depending on how these things work out, we could kind of get past this, and even our definitions of these things would have to change quite a bit. When it comes to attitudes towards multiracial backgrounds, they have gotten a bit better, right? But now people from mixed backgrounds still do, they feel less pressure to claim a single identity, but there is still this idea of fitting yourself into a box, fitting yourself into a societal category that can be really jarring for people because they're like, well, that doesn't represent me, right? So, you have someone like Barack Obama, right? Our first black president, but technically our first mixed race president, right? To say, he would say, okay, well, my mother's white, my father's black. But because of our kind of historically racist understandings of race that come from slavery, we have that notion of the one drop rule, right? If you have any, basically African descent of any kind, you're black. Even if you're, you have like basically all of your ancestry up to a point, basically everyone else in that family tree, or even half of your lineage, like with Barack Obama, right? Your mom's white, your dad's black. You're not considered half white, half black. You're considered black. So it's really interesting to see how the social notions of these things affect it much more so than the realities of how complex. Like, we already are more racially complex than we think we are, right? Because we force everyone into these weirdly small categories that don't really explain us. Right? So it's interesting. In the reading, they talked about how the majority of whites feel that the majority of racial groups now have equal chances in getting jobs and doing well. You've got to be out of your damn mind, right? So this is partially the result of false narratives that race is not a problem anymore, that it's a problem of the past. And a lot of this, too, is the result of what we call tokenizing, right? You tokenize successful people of color, then you can just somehow ignore the structural and cultural barriers that they face in achieving success, right? To say, oh, well, we had a black president, Barack Obama. Or, oh, look at Oprah. She's one of the richest people in the United States. And you're like, yeah, but that doesn't mean that every black woman has the opportunity to be Oprah. It just means that, yes, she did work hard. Yes, she has humble beginnings, but that doesn't somehow, completely account for the structural and cultural barriers that people face, right? And so, again, it's this bizarre thing that we do with tokenizing. We say, well, look at this person at the finish line. They were able to make it to the finish line, so why can't you? And that's just a justification so that we don't have to actually alleviate the social problems by doing anything, right? Because we just say, oh, it's your fault. Also, oh my God, making this even worse. I mean, how delusional do you have to be to think, no, everything's equal now? Is reverse racism, which is not a thing, right? Oftentimes, there are some white folks that think it is a thing. But here's the real deal. It may be discrimination, but it's not racism, right? So let's say you're a white folk and you're like the one white person at your job, right? And your job is, basically composed of other ethno-racial groups, and they basically kind of single you out and treat you like shit, right? That's discrimination. No one likes that. Every one of us has, at some point in our lives experienced some form of discrimination, and it sucks. And it should be that thing that, like, when you face it, to think, man, I don't want to do this as anyone else. This is awful, right? Unfortunately, when it comes to some of these folks, they literally think, well, it's racism. They're treating me terrible because I'm white. But it's not racism. And the reason is it might be discrimination. To single someone out and treat them differently because of a category of their identity, that is discrimination. But racism has to do with the power structures, the political structures, the social structures, the embedded institutional inequalities, right? You can't pretend as if, white people were stolen from another country, forced into labor for hundreds of years, then basically forced into a social secondary status for many years, had policies that destroyed their communities, that literally bombed progressive movements within the culture, that, disproportionately incarcerated and affected, have really stigmatized and created a whole cultural notions around the idea of less worth and less value. That just doesn't happen to white people. Like, that's just not reality. Meaning, yeah, maybe you're treated bad in that situation, but then you leave that situation and you don't face all of that same stigma. So that's how you know it's not reverse racism. It's not a thing, right? Because to reverse racism, you'd have to reverse the entire history of American society, which is insane, right? So, I mean, obviously that's not what it is. But it's fascinating. We do this thing we call it playing the race card, right? When someone brings up issues of race in the context of receiving unfair treatment, but it's a way to be dismissive, right? And basically say, oh, you have a different status, or you might have different experiences because you're a person of color. It makes it seem like, oh no, that person just has like an emotional problem, right? They're just super highly reactive. Why can't they take a joke? And this is super related to that whole PC culture kind of thing, right? So there's this idea, again, there's a societal or like kind of a cultural imperative here, right? Because why would you have a justification like that? Why would you say, oh, this person's just playing the race card? Because then you don't have to do anything, right? If you dismiss completely that there's any social inequalities, right? Oh, no, there's not racism. Racism was a thing in the past, maybe for your grandparents, but not for you. And if we don't look at institutional discrimination or research or knowledge that shows how some of these inequalities that happened generations ago are still playing out today, like 6 generations later, then we know that we don't at all see the full scope of this stuff, right? So, but again, if we just dismiss it and say, oh, it's just you're just really sensitive, then we don't have to do anything to repair racism or institutional inequalities. We just say, you're just being reactive. That has nothing to do with race. And so we see this a lot with our dog whistling, right? Or like, Donald Trump was the best example of this, like the kind of coded, make America great again. This idea, like, when was America ever better for people of color? Never. So how would you say making it great again? It really is just a dog whistle, saying let's go back to before queer people had rights, before women had rights, before a civil rights movement happened, to a better time, right, in the past. But really, it's a very specific kind of white supremacist dog whistle to people to hear, to say, oh, this means let's get rid of those things that let's make sure that we go back to a time when there was much more institutionalized inequality. right? And again, it's so dismissive and awful. And I think this comes into place a lot with the war on drugs because so much of the issues of the criminal justice system are somewhat colorblind or are basically coded in a way. But when we hear certain words like, oh, those hoodlums, those thugs, we know what that means, right? There's racialized notions to those things. But we basically now try to just dismiss it by saying, oh, this person's just being sensitive. No one ever said the N word, so what's the big deal? And it's crazy because the intent is there and the dog whistle, those people that want to hear it can hear it. So some more information about this. The intersection they talked about in the reading was discrimination in the absence of ethno-racial difference, which is fascinating, right? Japan's Byakumin. The example is basically how even when there's not a distinct racialized group, we socially create that difference, right? And then that becomes reinforced generationally. So even though the Byakumin are biologically, religiously, and ethnically indistinguishable from other Japanese people, they're still considered a completely different race that's inferior, right? So they were forced to live in these special villages and wear recognizable clothing so they could be identified. And so they're stereotyped as mentally weak, as aggressive, impulsive, dirty. And while their treatment has improved in recent years, there's still a lot of, social consequences of this, right? They still suffer more than any other Japanese citizens. And they have the lowest incomes, the lowest educational attainment of any group in Japan. So it's kind of fascinating in a situation where people are not even socially or, basically easily ethnically distinguishable, there's still ways in which we create categories, right? We love to subdivide race and ethnicity, so the author projects that maybe what will happen in the future is that we'll create more narrowly defined groups, such as ethnic group distinctions that will themselves seek cultural, social, and legal recognition. So maybe instead of calling everyone, we could just call everyone American, right? Instead of those pan-ethnic categories, that there be kind of different ways to do this. Instead of saying Asian, Latinx, Black, white, these things are vague and include an incredible diversity of groups into each category. So another thing they talked about was Americanization, so as more competition takes over our economy and more groups struggle, there's a fear that more people will become like MAGA motivated, right? And see racial and ethnic groups and protections for them to be the problem. So according to Eduardo Bonilla Silva, the U.S. is already evolving into a much more complex, what he calls triracial system. So he creates these three categories that he calls whites, honorary whites, and collective blacks. So whites are at the top of this hierarchy, and the definition assumes that this also includes assimilated Latinx folks, Europeans, and urban Native Americans. Honorary whites are those who have received middle-class status, like a lot of Arab families, some Asian Americans, such as Japanese Americans, Chinese, and Korean Americans. And then last, you have the collective black group, which has the least power and the least status in society, including dark-skinned Latinx groups, dark-skinned Asians, Filipinos, Southeast Asians, and reservation-bound Native Americans. So he's saying that it's more complex than just our kind of ethno-racial boundaries that we already have. Also, the color matters as to status and power. And also, even within these categories, you have some folks that are created or that get more privileges and access to these more mainstream groups or, society, while others in those same pan-ethnic categories do not, right? So he thinks that's a better way to kind of understand the social dynamics of the different groups. So when it comes to the futures of gender and sexual dichotomous thinking is so built into our cultural, into the institutions themselves and our cultural values that while most people do not identify with the gender binary as much as we assume that they do, it will not disappear as a mechanism of social control. So the changes in ideas of sex and gender over time, obviously we can see the result of that and how much it's, kind of evolved, right? That we've changed in the past and we're going to continue to do so. So even our understandings of, intersexuals, transsexuals, and transgender communities has very radically changed in the last, 15 to 20 years. So issues that, you know, intersexual, transsexual, and transgender communities face are much more commonly understood now. There's much more visibility for these communities than ever before. And that will still continue on, but the real issue is social, right? That we think that people need to inherently change in order to fit societal expectations, which is otherwise known as that social emergency, right? The need to dichotomize, especially in sex and gender, right? It's not that intersexual babies need medical intervention. They receive surgeries because of the normal expectations of their families and doctors. So, this normal family, this definition itself has changed quite a bit from the ideal of the male breadwinner and the female homemaker, which itself, of course, was an ideal that was classist and racist by design, but it doesn't reflect most American families, and it never did, even in the heyday of its promotion. So, changes in work and family have the potential, really, to transform the meanings of gender and really sexuality for future generations. If we expect men to take on more parenting roles, if we provide paid family leave, if, we have more equitable split domestic work in the home, we can transform gender expectations of future generations. So working families are very common, but so are the stigmas against working mothers. We can change that, right? We can change the sense as both parents working becomes more normative. But careers themselves are still modeled after traditional male careers of the past that rely on someone's unpaid labor at home to keep everything running, right? To make the food, to clean the clothes, all those things, etc. So that, that one breadwinner can focus on work. So if we can reframe this conflict between being a good employee and being a good parent, we could help families navigate those struggles and really provide better family situations for a lot of people. So when it comes to the future of sexuality, a lot of this has to do with kind of blurring what we understand now. We have those, again, those binaries, because we like to divide and categorize, but as we talked about with Kinsey and his research, people are much more complex when it comes to their sexuality. So it's nearly impossible to imagine a society in which some forms of sexual expression are not privileged over others. But the level of division itself is already starting to change. And when it comes to public understandings and support for sexual minorities, these things can incredibly improve the rights, the access, and just really alleviate the stigmas and the inequalities that are connected to being marginal or having less, hegemony or power in the culture. So the future place of sexuality in the stratification system may have to do with legal recognition. So, having federal laws to protect same sex marriage and adoption, having work protections and other legal protections for gays and lesbians and bisexuals isn't very important to limiting issues of stratification, but it's not enough, right? Those are just the baseline steps that the legal structure, the political structure, the social structure has to reflect a better, more balanced, more equitable approach to sexuality. And really, nowadays, we're understanding that even the kind of, not just binary notion of heterosexual, homosexual, but even just only understanding sexuality as heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual is still too limiting to people's actual experiences and identities. And that more and more terminology and concepts are coming out to represent different subgroups within groups so that people can find a place where they feel that, yes, that group represents my interests or, my internalized desires or whatever it might be. Because then once you have a group, once you have some representation, you have more power. As we saw in, the film that we watched earlier in the class, a lot of the gay men that were pictured in the film, especially growing up, didn't know anyone else, didn't have a community. And as a result, were very critical of themselves, felt very, very alone and alienated. And it affected their social health, their mental health, all of these things that creating that community, even if it was some dingy, gross bar that had watered down mob beer, whatever the hell that is, then, that was still such an important thing just to have a baseline of a community of other people you can be with that, don't look down on you just because of who you are. All right, so when we look at income as another stratification outlook, so the distinctions between the rich and the poor, unfortunately, this is not something we're getting better about, right? This is actually getting so much worse in recent years. I mean, the Trump tax plan made him incredibly worse, and obviously the whole coronavirus thing is just wow, so much worse. As a lot of the bills to try to help stimulate the economy are focusing really on corporations and the richest folks instead of helping everyday families and people that aren't getting enough money through their unemployment or even getting unemployment at all, especially people that are undocumented or I know California opened up a fund specifically for the undocumented during that time, but again, it's very difficult because oftentimes, in a crisis, we still use our metrics of worth, which of course are inequalities, as to who gets help and who doesn't, right? So in a lot of ways, income inequality is increasing and getting a lot worse. We have a handful of people in this country that have more money than the bottom 80% of the population, which should be criminal, but is instead protected by these awful laws. So the gaps between the rich and the poor are growing. They continue to grow. The rich control the elected officials who tailor the laws to take away regulations and taxes on industries that only benefit the rich and oftentimes actually cause public health issues that kill thousands of us every year, right? Like when you look at air quality protections and things like that, that people like the Koch brothers try to strike down with all their money and buy all their politicians because they're oil industry people and they want to keep poisoning the environment to make money. Because of the result of their actions that they take, the millions and millions of dollars that they dump in each year into the political system, they can basically, through ALEC, through all these other kind of organizations, create structures of law so that what they want to have accomplished works and they save, millions or billions of dollars as a result of this. But there's literally thousands of people that die because those air quality standards are there for a reason, right? To protect public safety and public health. So that's one example. But again, you know, everything is also getting more expensive. So the only people who can afford college are rich people. The only people who can buy a home are rich people, right? So it becomes only the richest while the rest of us struggle, even working multiple jobs. I mean, this is very different than in the past, right? It's really kind of interesting. There's this great film, I believe it's still on Netflix, you can watch called Inequality for All. Robert Reich, just great. You got to follow him on Twitter. He's fire. But anyway, he really outlines this idea of what he calls the prosperity cycle of how when we look at other countries to say, oh, what country does it better, who should we model our economic system over so we don't have so much income inequality, he actually argues we should model it after America in the past, right? As a result of what happened in the Great Depression, right? That we had public infrastructure programs, we invested in education, right? We had all of these positive things that gave more financial power to the people at the lower income levels, and as a result, leveled out inequality quite a bit, right? But once we hit the late 70s, you get deregulation, you hit the 80s with Reagan, you get this incredible cutting of, from over 70% taxes on the rich to under 35%. All of a sudden, we have these huge deficits every couple years, we have these huge recessions every decade, and it's as a result of the billionaires pilfering billions and billions of trillions of dollars out of our economy every year that never comes back because they put it in some offshore account or, you have someone like Jeff Bezos who makes incredible amounts of money, right? The owner of Amazon, but won't even pay, for worker protections in the coronavirus or, basically is only able to amass billions and billions of dollars by paying substandard wages to employees. It was a big deal that he offered $15. This is a guy who makes hundreds of billions of dollars. I mean, he is worth so much damn money that it's incredible to think that, oh, $15, that's really going to kill him. Like, it's completely flawed and insane, right? But it should be criminal. It really should be. If our legal structure had any veracity to it, that would be criminal, right? Because you could only amass so much wealth off of the backs of the laborers. So economic inequality depends on the choices we make as a society. If we ask the rich to, like, I don't know, pay their goddamn taxes, right? Or if the most profitable businesses actually had to pay taxes at all, as we discussed before, because of that tax plan, we went from having 30 of the largest corporations paying no taxes to 60 of the largest corporations paying no taxes, meaning last year AT&T paid nothing, right? You have Amazon actually got millions of dollars in refund, which is insane. Like, it's literally insane for how much money they made. So you have, Apple, these other corporations that make billions of dollars a year are able to get these sweetheart deals and pay no taxes, literally zero taxes, or I often even get refunds, which is completely insane. Because if we just tax them like they do in other countries, we could reduce some of these overall gaps and use that money from the rich to build infrastructure, to fund education, to make college free, right? Or at least affordable like it is in pretty much every other developed nation, right? That we often compare ourselves to. We could finance healthcare through universal coverage and have, universal preschool coverage so that all kids would enter school ready to learn and have, literacy. And it wouldn't just be about how much money you have, right? And there's like a million more examples, right? Subsidized childcare, let alone daycare, let alone preschool, right? Subsidized childcare so people can actually afford to have their child somewhere safe that, while they're working, because that's something that we just take for granted. Nope, you have a stay-at-home mom taking care of your kids, and you're like, no, most families are dual earning households, right? We also need paid family leave, not just paid maternity leave, which is incredibly abhorrent that we don't have, especially nationally, but paid family leave so that it's not just about giving birth and making sure that both parents are there, but also, what if someone gets sick? We're a country where there's a huge, cancer rates and things of this nature. You need to take care of a loved one. Then what are you supposed to do? It's like, well, you have to choose between your job and taking care of that person. So a lot of people go into financial hardships largely because they're an empathetic person just trying to help their families. And so, or just trying to like have a kid or things like this. It becomes this huge consideration. Like a cousin of mine, when she gave birth, she basically spent 3 years before conceiving trying to plan out any way to cobble together money so that she could have any sort of maternity leave, right? So she's a teacher. So she saved up basically like 3+ years of sick days, of vacation days, of everything, cobbled them all together. She got the 6 weeks paid from California, offers 6 weeks paid. And nationally, the FMLA gives you 12 weeks unpaid, meaning they have to keep your job for a couple months while you're on leave, but you don't get any money, which is insane because most of us can't go 3-4 months without working and still have money to pay rent. It's just not possible. So, but again, in other countries, some of these protections extend to like 6 months or more, which is insane to think like, yeah, there's a structure of a system that actually supports people. So you don't have to choose between having children and having a career. You don't have to choose between being a parent and being an employee or being a boss sometimes. Like, let's say you have a small business or something like that. You have the opportunity to still keep above, the poverty line, keep yourself afloat in situations like that. So, that's just some examples of the things that we could do with all that money instead of just giving it to billionaires to put on their offshore islands, or their so they can buy another yacht to go inside of their yachts. Like, we can do so much with that, right? I mean, there are all sorts of these things are actually available not just in other developed countries, but in a lot of like much poorer countries than us have, free education, not just K through 12, but, through college, have, medical coverage for everyone. Like these things that we think, oh, we can't do that. And you're like, really? I thought we were USA number one. We're the best. We can do everything. We're better than everyone else. Why is it we can have a military that just the amount that we increased to the military last year was more than like the next 5 militaries combined? That the cost of our military is more than the next 10 countries combined in levels of how much money they spend. But we can't have universal health care, which literally places that we put under embargo, like Cuba, have. How can they do it under an embargo, but we can't do it as the richest country in the history of the world? We can. We just don't care enough. We don't have those priorities. Plus, when you look at who pays for it, meaning it's not just about having a universal system, it's about the fact that our political system is so, unduly influenced by this money. So politicians, one of the biggest funders of politicians is the pharmaceutical industry. One of the second is, well, actually, I think the second is the insurance industry. So if the majority of, and we're not just talking conservatives or Republicans here, we're talking the majority of Democrats in the House and Senate, are not okay with a Medicare for all, are not supporting a universal healthcare plan. Well, why would that be? Maybe it's the tens of thousands of dollars per election year that the pharmaceutical industry hands them, that the insurance industry hands them, so that they decide, maybe we'll not create a medical system that actually gets rid of private insurance. Why? Because they're going to give me money so I can run again. Right? So that is so corrupting and disgusting, but that's how money works, right? It can become power in a lot of ways, right? So we have to understand that. We have to see that economic inequality, it's our choices. We can make better choices, right? Meaning, how is it that we don't realize that this actually works for all of us? Meaning, if there's better healthcare, if there's better education, that's a better workforce. That's even better for the damn rich people, meaning the rich do better when the poor and middle class do better. Because think about it, when the poor and middle class do better, they have enough money to buy all the shit that rich people are selling, right? So it actually works out for them, for the middle class and the poor, to have more money. So when we look at future intersections, we often fail to see the hardships that others experience. So it's hard for most of us to see how one person losing their rights means that none of our rights are safe. It's a slippery slope. It's hard for people to see how our thoughts and beliefs and actions lead to and support other people's subordination and disadvantage. So if you're one of those, quote unquote white feminists, right? Or I used to call it second wave before we came out with Karen as a way to describe it, right? Where you get your gender oppression, like you understand, like, hey, women shouldn't, be subordinated, but you ignore how race plays an incredibly important role, or sometimes, it's denying the importance of sexuality or other marginalities, like how you can only see you can't see past your own nose, basically. You can only see your own oppression as mattering. Right? When we expand our views, we can see that we're all privileged and oppressed at the same time, that we inhabit all sorts of different social locations depending on the institutions we're affiliated with. And as a result, we have to see how connected we are, and how when one group is able to be subordinated, that opens the door for all of us, and we should care and ally with each other. So meaningful social change can only take place when we realize that we all experience some privilege or penalty from those existing power relations. So if we see the intersectional, if we see how complicated and interwoven systems like race, class, gender, sexuality, disability, age, all these different things, nationality, immigration status, all of these different factors and so many more that we deal with in our daily lives that impact our, identities, we need to change those dichotomous thinkings, because they limit how we see ourselves, how we see other people as people, right? When you can put someone in a category instead of actually just seeing them as another person, right? We see people as either this or that instead of seeing them as ultimately human, right? Or ultimately as a reflection of ourselves, right? That's the thing that I find fascinating, and not to get all weird and existential, but we are locked on a weird little planet together. We are infinitely the same, right? We're made of the same space dust. We're on the same trapped in planet. Like the idea that if you were kind of anthropologically coming from space as a space alien, right, to our culture, you'd be like, what do you mean there's all these divisions? You're all humans. That's your category. You're the same, right? That our trivial differences of gender and sex and, class and race and all of these things that we've socially created would mean literally nothing to, like, our alien overlords. Not to say they'd be our overlords, but probably if they have enough technology to get here. But anyway, that to them, we'd all be the same. They wouldn't care about our, racial status or our income status or any of that crap. That's just all what we socially create. So what we realize is if we can do that macro sociological, imagination and step back, we can actually picture a future without those divisions, without those kind of social problems that result from the divisions, and a world where we just have much more meaningful equity.